macromolecule we're going to look at are nucleic acids. Nucleic acids including deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, and also ribonucleic acid, which is RNA. Okay, so those are nucleic acids. Of course, it's the molecule of life. It's the code of life. Okay, so inside every organism on Earth, you have this DNA material, or some simple organisms like viruses, you can have some RNA there too, but it is the code of life. So that's what carries all the instructions for making what you are. Okay, so those instructions are brought out as proteins, which we already talked about a little bit. But by the same token, you have these long, big molecules called DNA or RNA. They're made up of monomers, which monomer is a nucleotide. Okay, so a nucleotide consists of a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. All right. So here's a ring compound, which is a sugar. So this would be deoxyribose sugar. So you have an oxygen here, but you have a carbon there, carbon there, carbon there, carbon there, and a carbon there. Okay, they use certain nomenclature here. So this is carbon 1, C1, C2, C3, C4, and then that would be C5. So that's the sugar portion of it. Okay, here's a phosphate off of carbon 3. You have a phosphate group. And then off carbon number 1, you have a base, and the base can either be adenine, thymine, guanine, or cytosine for DNA. Okay? And with RNA, you have a uracil substitutes for the thymine. Okay? But those are the 5 different bases that you can have off of here. Okay? The bases can vary a little bit. They're classified first as the purines. Purines are a little bit longer, okay, bigger. Okay, that's adenine and guanine, and then the pyrimidines would be thymine and cytosine, also uracil there if it's an RNA. Okay, but those would be the pyrimidines. So when they match up, you always have to match a purine with a pyrimidine. So when you're matching up, because DNA is a double helix, okay, so it's just got this spiral here, okay, and it's combined in a certain way. It's called anti-parallel strands. So if you look here, remember we say that's C5 there. This is a 5' end there. This would be the 3' end down here. The strand it's going to combine with would be parallel to it, but actually they call it anti-parallel because this would be the 3' end and this is the 5' end. Okay, so they call that anti-parallel. When they match up, there's always a certain pattern. Okay, so A always goes with T. So if this is matched up, this is going to be a T here. Okay, so if that's an A, of course, this would be a T here. This is a G here. This would have to be a C. If that's a T there, this would have to, of course, be an A. Right. It turns out when they bind together, remember these are all covalent bonds in here. The binding of the 2 strands is actually just by hydrogen bonds. And between the adenine and the thymine, there's actually 2 hydrogen bonds. 2 hydrogen bonds there. Between the guanine and the cytosine, though, there are actually 3 hydrogen bonds. So that makes that a little bit stronger bond, which can be significant later on when we study nucleic acids in a little more depth. All right? But just keep that in mind. Okay, because of that pattern there, most covalent bonds are much stronger, about 20 times stronger. Okay, so it keeps it together, but you can, for example, heat up DNA and you can actually split it apart a little bit easier. So that'll come to effect a little bit later on in the year. All right, and then of course RNA is different than DNA. DNA, of course, is this double helix, double strand. RNA is just a single strand. Instead, it substitutes uracil for thymine. And instead of deoxyribose sugar, you have ribose sugar instead. Next macromolecule are lipids. Okay, lipids, of course, are key definition about this type of biological macromolecule is insoluble in water. Okay, therefore you have a lot of nonpolar bonds. Okay, a lot of carbon-carbon bonds, a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds, which makes it nonpolar in nature. Okay, so it will not dissolve in water. Dissolve in water. All right, lipids. Key thing, energy storage. Okay, 9 kilocalories per gram. So they're the most effective at that. You can get energy from carbohydrates at 4, and also proteins at 4 kilocalories per gram. But lipids is twice as efficient at storing up energy, store them up in these carbon-carbon, carbon-hydrogen bonds. Also really important in structures in your body, especially membranes. Cell membranes are primarily lipids, specifically phospholipids, which we'll talk about later on. And then also key in hormones. Hormones sometimes are proteins, but there are sex hormones and some other hormones which are lipid in nature. Okay, so important to understand how lipids work. Okay, so again, lipids is not exactly the monomer-polymer relationship we have in the other macromolecules. Right? But what we have here is a glycerol unit. Okay, glycerol is 3 carbons, okay, with hydrogens and hydroxyl groups on each one. Then you have fatty acids, which they combine with. Right? So the key lipid is what's called a triglyceride. Okay, so 3 carbons here. Each of these is attached onto a long fatty acid chain. And just like with all the other macromolecules, guess how they're put together? Okay, that's right, a condensation or dehydration reaction, where you're going to remove the water, okay, and then the oxygen will get in there and you get rid of that, so it is a dehydration, and these then will combine. Okay, so that would be one fatty acid chain. Okay. Another, of course, fatty acid is organic acid, which is COOH, along with a long chain of hydrocarbons. Each carbon, which you have hydrogens on each one of these, kind of simplified it there, it's long chains. Okay. Sometimes that's signified. Here's the carboxyl group here, acid group, and then they just do this for it. Every one of these junctures here is where a carbon is. Okay, that's just to simplify things a little bit. And then on this last one here, I have a carboxyl group and then this hydrocarbon chain, but I have a double bond there. All right. Okay, so it turns out you can classify lipids as being saturated or unsaturated. Saturated means they have all single bonds in the fatty acid. Unsaturated is if they have one or more double bonds. Okay, that double bond puts a little crink in the tail, okay, which prevents it from packing together. So saturated fats or lipids tend to be solids at room temperature, whereas unsaturated, okay, have that fold in the tail so they don't pack together so tightly, so they are usually liquids at room temperature. Okay, so lipids, energy, structure. Do some carbs. All right, carbohydrates. One of the macromolecules for biological organisms, right? Get the general formula CH2O, right? So think about it, glucose, C6H12O6, it's got that formula, that would be a 6 there. Okay, so that's carbohydrates general formula. Okay, a major thing with carbohydrates, they give energy, quick energy. Okay, it doesn't store as effectively as lipids, but it is great for energy storage, that's the primary function. And then it's also used in structures in your body. Like plant cellulose, right? So the basic unit, of course, is a monosaccharide, okay? And then they put those together to make disaccharides, and then many of them together would be polysaccharides. Okay, so this would be a structure of a monosaccharide. Some examples of monosaccharides: glucose, fructose, galactose, ribose. Okay, considered to be simple sugars. Okay, so you have, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons there. You can see that. So this would be C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6. Okay, so there's a basic structure of a one of the monosaccharides. Here's another one, and you guys can guess by now what happens when you take one monosaccharide with another. Okay, of course you lose an H2O, so again a condensation or dehydration reaction. So you get rid of that, and then you get a bond between C1 carbon here and C4 carbon there, and you make a disaccharide. Okay, some common disaccharides are sucrose or table sugar, and you've heard of maltose, lactose, that's in milk sugar. Okay, so you can always identify a sugar by OSE. So if you have OSE at the end of a word, it's going to be a sugar. Right? So those are both considered to be simple sugars. You put a lot of them together, okay, you make what are called polysaccharides. Okay, so huge chains. some common ones, starch, of course, which is the storage of sugar in plants. Okay, so starchy foods like breads and potatoes and so forth have a lot of starch. It's highly branched glucose monomer together. And then you have glycogen. Glycogen is the storage carbohydrate in animals like us. We can store a certain amount of glycogen in all our cells, and then we can also store a little bit more in our liver. Okay? It's alpha glucose, which is highly branched. And then the most abundant organic molecule on Earth is cellulose. Okay? So cellulose is actually a beta glucose. But of course you find that in plant cell walls, and of course plants are all around you. You can see a garden back there. Even this green, it's got plant cells have a membrane, and around the membrane they have a wall, and that wall is composed of cellulose. Okay, so polysaccharides, key structure there. Okay, but again, energy for animals is primary function of carbohydrates.